Buenos noches and good evening, everybody, and welcome to LibertyCon Europe 2026. My name is Stefan Acimovic, and I'm the European Programs Director for Students for Liberty, and I will be your host this weekend. So thank you for being here, and welcome once again. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this annual meeting of like-minded individuals and to the heart of the European pro-liberty movement. This will be the 14th LibertyCon Europe we are hosting and the second time of doing so here in Madrid. I would like to take this opportunity now to thank our Spanish partners and speakers who have contributed to us coming back here to Madrid and spreading the word to the Spanish student community and audience about the ideas behind this conference and the importance of the pro-liberty movement here in Europe. Muchas gracias. This evening's reception is supposed to be an appetizer, a tapas plate of what is to come tomorrow and on Sunday with our main programming. With over 70 local and international speakers, this will be certainly the most complex conference you will attend this year, so pick your sessions wisely. Tonight is meant to bring together all of you, our distinguished partners, speakers, friends, and colleagues. Amongst you are those who have been to all of the previous 13 LibertyCons, as well as those for whom this will be the first LibertyCon you're attending. This is a great network that we have built and we continue to build. If this is your first time here, if you are a Spanish person who has never been to a pro-liberty event before, I ask you to speak to people from Students for Liberty, from the partners at the partner fair tomorrow and on Sunday, and meet new friends and new colleagues. Before we get into tonight's programming, I wanted also to honor the Students for Liberty staff that has worked tirelessly on this conference for the last year, as well as the 100 or so of our local students, local volunteers, and coordinators who will be managing this conference. This is a conference for students, by the students, and I honor all of the students here today. A few notes before we get into the sessions. So this is a reception for tonight, which means there is a bar on the other side. For those who would like to get drinks, you will have to go back the way you came from and enter it from the outside. This door will be open once we are done with the sessions tonight. It is a quick programming, as I said, a small tapas plate, but afterwards, the party will continue outside and here in this room, and you can mingle all you want. Now back to the programming. Tonight is designed to stimulate discussions for the weekend. It is reserved for two of the most pressing issues today that concern us all, but especially young people coming up in an ever more chaotic world and uncertain future we find ourselves in: education and economic prospects. Where are we now and where are we going? What is the classical liberal answer to these ever-changing landscapes? To answer these questions tonight, we have a stage full of doctors. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Matthew Mitchell, Dr. Ilya Somin, PhD candidate Jan Mošovský, and Spain's very own Dr. Gabriel Calzada.
All right, thank you, Stefan, for starting us off. And let me get directly to what we are discussing today, and that is by a short introduction from everybody about what is economic freedom, how do we understand it, and why is it important to be having this conversation right now. Matt, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Jan. So what I would say is economic freedom, just succinctly, I'll give you one sentence and then I'll kind of dissect it a little bit. People have more economic freedom when they're allowed to make more of their own economic choices. So let me just highlight three words here that are kind of key. So one is allowed. The idea of economic freedom, just like the idea of freedom more broadly, is it's about what others allow you to do, not about what you are able to do. So it may surprise some of you, but I cannot dunk on a regulation-sized basketball rim, right? So I'm not capable of doing that, but I am perfectly allowed to do that. Nobody's stopping me. So that's the keyword number one is allowed. Number two is people have more economic freedom when they're allowed to make more of their economic choices. So I'd highlight more. The idea there is that it's a spectrum, right? So it has to do with, there are places that can be more or less restrictive of your freedom, and in terms of what they permit you to do, and they can be, they might allow you to open a business, but not open a business in this place or this type of business, or they may allow you to open a business, but it's going to be a high tax. So it's a spectrum. And then the third point word I would highlight is economic. So the point here is that economic freedoms are really a subset of all freedoms. It's really a part of all human choice. But we're zeroing in on the question of economic activity. So you have more, to succinctly say it, you have more economic freedom when you're allowed to make more of your economic choices, choices about buying and selling and starting businesses and setting prices and choosing your production techniques and all of that sort of stuff.
Understood. Ilya, do you want to continue and maybe take up the second part of the question? Why is it important that it is right now that we are talking about this?
Sure. Well, I think there are many definitions of economic freedom, but I think Robert Nozick, the great libertarian philosopher, said it best when he said, economic freedom is the freedom to engage in capitalist acts between consenting adults. Anytime people are able to make beneficial exchanges of economically valuable goods and services, that's economic freedom. When people move for economic purposes, like through international and domestic migration, that's economic freedom. Trade is economic freedom, and so on. I think economic freedom is always important, both because it's an important component of freedom more generally, and because it is so essential to human welfare and innovation and prosperity. But it's also perhaps even more important at the present moment because there are so many gathering threats to it. Throughout most of my life, the biggest threat to economic freedom arguably was socialism. Today, it's actually nationalism, and I'm sure I will talk further about that during this panel, but it threatens the economic freedom of migration, the economic freedom of trade, the economic freedom of private sector control of enterprise as opposed to government taking stakes in them and engaging in industrial planning, and it also threatens us with large-scale crony capitalism and corruption, where even formally private businesses, instead of focusing on serving customers and engaging in mutually beneficial transactions, they instead have to serve at the pleasure of various government officials, sometimes in an openly corrupt way, even sometimes the corruption is implicit, but either way, it is a deviation from economic freedom.
Thank you. And Gabriel?
I would say economic freedom is basically when you're able to direct your life, your resources, your passion, your energy to those goals that you deem important, that you think they're worth to dedicate your life to, or your time, or your resources. And whatever stop you from doing that, whether it is the government or some crony entrepreneurs, that is making impossible you to exercise your freedom in order to do with your life what you really want to do. So economic freedom is really one of the deepest freedom that exists. That is dedicating your life and your resources to that thing that you think it's important, or those things you think are important. And I think, as my colleagues here said, it is really important to discuss this today, because both from the left and from the right, it looks like there is a consensus that economic freedom is not anymore something that societies should pursue.
Understood. Matt, you spent a lot of time the last 30 years measuring economic freedom through the Economic Freedom of the World Index that I encourage everybody to check out. How does one measure something as complex as economic freedom, and what have you learned in the time that you've been doing that?
So the story began well before I got on board, but the idea here actually emerged from a conference in 1984 in London, not unlike this type of conference, people were on a panel discussing the relationship between economic and political freedoms. And it kind of ended in sort of a frustration that, oh boy, we don't exactly know how these two things relate, and so we kind of have to throw up our hands and say we don't know what the relationship is. And so one of the panelists, Mike Walker, who's the founder of the Fraser Institute, and was on the panel, and he sat down with Milton and Rose Friedman for lunch, and he said, well, let's measure it. And from what I understand, I think Milton was especially skeptical at first, but Mike convinced Rose, and then Rose convinced Milton, and then they set out to find economists who could measure economic freedom. And so the basic idea was, what emerged was, again, going back to that, my definition is, if you can think of economic freedom as what you're allowed to do, you're allowed to make more of your own economic choices, then start thinking about, okay, what are the ways that governments can either permit you to make your own economic choices, to make capitalist acts permit capitalist acts between consenting adults or not. And essentially, you can kind of tick through the components of the index. They answer that question. So there's 5 areas. It's a total of 46 indicators, but they're grouped into 5 areas. The first are size of government. So government can stop you from making your own economic choices through high taxes and control of resources. The second is legal system and property rights. Government can permit you to make more of your own capitalist acts through consenting adults by ensuring that you have property rights well protected, contracts are well protected, that sort of thing. Area 3 is money freedom, essentially freedom to access money so governments promise that the money that it issues will maintain its value, or if government gets out of the way and allows you to access some other type of currency that's going to maintain its value. And then there's freedom to trade internationally, and then there's freedom from regulation. And so all of these components, we look at things like tax rates and how easy it is to start a business, how well protected are property rights, put them all together, 46 indicators. It's basically an average of an average of an average. You kind of put it together, and for each of 165 countries going all the way back to 1970, we now have a measure of economic freedom. And in terms of what we learn from it, first of all, the index really does comport with, I think, your intuition about what are places where you are allowed to make more of your economic choices versus others. So it's not surprising, I think, when you look at the index, that places like the United States are relatively free. Not the freest necessarily in the world, but I'm American, so I'll say we. I deserve no credit for the economic freedom of the United States, but it's 5th in the world. Hong Kong is number 1, Singapore is number 2. It makes sense that those places are sort of more economically free than Spain, but Spain is more economically free than Mexico. Mexico is more economically free than Brazil. Brazil is more economically free than Russia and China. So, one thing we learned is that it sort of comports with our intuition. And then the other extraordinary thing about this enterprise is, they started developing this index 30 years ago, but it's then been carried on as a research tool by economists. So it's now been used in over 1,000 peer-reviewed studies to assess the effect of economic freedom on things that people care about. And that's what's been, I think, most exciting about it, is that we've learned, people who live in more economically free societies, they earn a whole lot more. Growth is a lot higher. They live about, if you're comparing like the top quartile to the bottom quartile, they live about 16 years longer. Disparities between male and female earnings are much smaller. Environments are better cared for. People actually, strangely enough, you wouldn't necessarily guess this. I'm not even sure a lot of libertarians would guess this, but people tend to be less materialistic in these societies. So there are a lot of things that not only does it seem to make life better by the conditions that you would think, but there's also some sort of surprising results. So it's been a very fruitful sort of research path.
All right. Let me take it to Gabriel now, because we mentioned that one of the reasons we like economic freedom is because it delivers the goods. We are more abundant, we live longer, and we get all the benefits that you talked about that the index brought up. And I checked yesterday, I think Spain is 21st now in the world in economic freedom. The score is around 8 out of 10.
That has to be wrong.
And that's my question, because we definitely are on a relatively high level of abundance in Europe compared to the rest of the world, but we are not often talking about the amazing growth we have right now. We are more talking about stagnation. Spain has one of the highest youth unemployment in Europe. So how come? What's going wrong? How does the economic freedom not continue to deliver on the
high
prosperity?
youth unemployment, you have to explain 23% youth unemployment. Yes. How do we match those two things? You mean, right, Jan? That's a very good question, and it's not just for Spain, but for Europe in general, I guess. And I give you an example. I remember long time ago, we were having some gatherings. We were starting a think tank here, the Instituto Juan de Mariana, and we wanted to start a cafe, a place to have discussions and serve some coffees. It took us 5 years and a half to get the license. 5.5 years to get the license. The day that I received the license, like, you have granted a permission to open a coffee place in downtown Madrid. By then, we were in completely different type of project, so we didn't open the coffee place. And of course, the doing business would tell you that you could open a shop in Madrid or in Spain in 7 months or whatever, but that is not the reality. I mean, if 7 months, if you open something that is really standardized, otherwise the regulatory burden in countries like Spain is huge, If you do something that is very standard, you might be lucky and it takes a long time. If you're doing something a little bit different from what other people are doing, it takes forever. And most probably you despair and you leave the country and you go to a place where it's easier to start something and you win and you earn much more money. So I think regulatory burden is not, and I know that discussion you mentioned, Matt, I've heard it from Michael and from other people, and one of the reasons for that discussion in the origin of the index was, what about quality? What about quality? How do you measure the quality? How do you measure, there's some things that are qualitative, and how do we introduce them? And I'm sure that there are ways to slowly enrich it, but there are many qualitative issues that in Europe is making economic growth, economic liberty really difficult. And you don't see this in most indexes. I think regardless of the index you look, it is really difficult to understand that huge regulatory burden that Europeans suffered.
Understood. Let's move to some of the challenges, some of the obvious challenges that we face today, which you already, Ilya already started on, which is growing anti-globalism. Where does this threat come from? How do we face that, as you have recently as well? And maybe what are the trends we are observing there? Referring maybe back to the index, I think the latest publication has a subchapter on how the US would fare on economic freedom of trade if the Liberation Day tariff stayed in effect, which I think placed it on the 150-something position.
Right at the head of the Bahamas, I think.
Well, there is something there at least. Where is this coming from, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. So, in one sense, this is a new problem in that nationalist movements that want to restrict trade, immigration, and engage in industrial policy are much stronger today, both in the United States and in many European countries, than they were 8, 10, 12 years ago. There's different theories about why they're stronger today, but they clearly are. On the other hand, this is not a new danger. In the 19th and early 20th century, the forerunners of modern libertarianism, nationalism was the main ideology they had to fight against. The early libertarians of Britain, France, Germany, and so forth. This was sort of the main opponent that they faced. Von Mises and Hayek also wrote about this opponent, but in the mid to late 20th century, the socialist adversary became much more prominent for obvious reasons, and it's only recently that with socialism fading, nationalism has once again become the most significant opponent of libertarian or classical liberal ideology. There's different theories about why it has become that way, and we can talk about them later perhaps, but it clearly has in both the US and most European countries. The Republican Party under its current leadership intervenes in the economy far more than even any Democratic administration has since the 1930s. That's a big change. How do we fight it? Obviously, we'd all have a whole session just on that, but I'll mention a couple points. One is lots and lots of evidence, both in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere, shows that people hate high prices. And many nationalist policies cause high prices. That is very obviously true in the case of tariffs. When there are tariffs put on foreign goods, prices go up, and even you can explain that even to ignorant voters. I've read a lot about voter ignorance, as does Brian Kaplan, who's sitting here, but one thing that you can convey to voters often is like tariffs and other taxes raise prices. Mass deportations and immigration restrictions also raise prices because they eliminate a lot of the labor force that helps lower them and make the economy less efficient and so on. Various other kinds of nationalist policies raise prices as well, so emphasizing price increases is a proven political winner, and it's one that classical liberal movements should make more use of. This is not my original idea. Richard Cobden, one of the early British classical liberals, came up with this in the mid-19th century and used it to overturn Britain's corn laws, their restrictions on the import of food, and he was tremendously successful, and we should learn from that. A second way I think we can combat it is, and this is a more long-term strategy, is that if you think about successful movements for expanding liberty, both in the US and Europe, usually they emphasize how people that we thought were very different or inferior actually aren't. That's how we got the civil rights in the United States. People gradually realized that there's not a fundamental difference between blacks and whites, and you can't make an argument for giving human rights to white people that doesn't also apply to blacks. The story with women's rights, same thing. Nationalists, they want to restrict people's liberty based on who your parents are, where you were born, whether you're of the right ethnic group. They say things like la France aux Français, France for the French. France belongs to the ethnically French people, and everybody else, they can be kicked out or rendered inferior. This is vulnerable to the same kinds of long-term efforts at promoting understanding that racism within countries was vulnerable to. And then finally, nationalism has a different set of strengths and weaknesses compared to our previous adversary, socialism. Crudely put, socialism tends to appeal to highly educated, sophisticated people like some of us here. Nationalism is the exact opposite. All the studies show that it tends to appeal to lesser educated people, those who know less about politics. In some ways, that can be an advantage of nationalist movements. They can appeal to a wide range of people, but their relative lack of intelligence and sophistication is a weakness that I think we can exploit, and we should do more of that exploiting.
Let me stay with you on that. Many of the people, many who are the leaders of the nationalist authoritarian movement, very much understand the impact of the policies that they are pitching, and they go for them anyway, despite knowing how people react to increased prices and all these things. Is it because of the type of electorate that they have? Is that a grift on the people who support them in a sense, or is there maybe a bigger danger in the sense that there is now a larger proportion of the population who are willing to say, I am okay with being less well off, or I'm okay with taking a prosperity hit if I get some other values, whether that is some more closed off society or some other possible values that they might see?
I think many nationalists actually don't understand that their policies cause reductions in prosperity and higher price and the like, because they tend to have a zero-sum view of the world, that the only way our group can benefit is at the expense of other groups and vice versa. So the argument about trade is like, if goods are coming into the United States from another country, as Trump says, we're losers and that other country are winners. It's a zero-sum game. Similarly, if immigrants get jobs, then native-born Americans suffer, or native-born Spaniards or Frenchmen and so forth. And so the zero-sum view of the world is a major component of nationalism, and therefore many nationalists don't actually understand the true effects of their policies. Now, there are indeed some nationalists, particularly the so-called post-liberals, who, if pressed, they will say, yeah, I'm willing to accept a lower standard of living so I can have a stronger sense of community, and so I can be together with the people who are like me and they have the right values and not these inferior people of other cultures or the wrong religion and so forth. But if you put it that way, while there are certain kinds of intellectuals who like that appeal, most ordinary people, to the extent that nationalism appeals to them, it's more because they believe in the zero-sum view of the world, and they have a certain suspicion, which is part of human nature, of people who are different from them. Like, we still have the brains of Stone Age cavemen, and Stone Age cavemen, understandably, were suspicious of like people from other bands, from like the other cave that, a few miles away. And in that environment, maybe to some extent it really was a zero-sum game because productivity was so low. And we have that in our minds. And if you think that way, then it's natural to think that imports are bad because they take away work from us. Immigrants are bad because they take jobs that otherwise we could have. And we're naturally suspicious of people from other backgrounds. But we can, to some extent, overcome that. We have, to a great extent, with respect to things like racism and sexism, prejudice against gays and lesbians, which, in my memory, there was way worse 30, 40 years ago when I was young than it is today. And my hope is that with these kinds of nationalist prejudices, we can make progress in a similar way.
So there is hope. Staying on the question of values, Gabriel, you just returned from the US, and your work has taken you to many different places, working with young people. So have you experienced that people, either in Europe and the US or elsewhere in the world, see the value of economic freedom differently, or that they approach it in a different way, the importance of how free they are to open a business or to trade freely and do other related things?
My impression is that they see economic freedom in a very similar way, but they feel it in a very different way, and they experience it in a very different way. And perhaps the most important thing is that at the other side of the Atlantic, they experience it with a lot of optimism. What I see here is that most people who think about the experience with economic freedom, or how they experience economic freedom, is with a lot of skepticism about whether this is going to lead to a good port or not. And while you go to, it's not just the US, it's the whole, the Americas. You see that people think that if they work hard, they save, they invest, and they get a good community around them, they will succeed and they will reach their dreams. Here, very few people think that because they think at one point they will change the rules, then I will succeed, but then someone who has better connections will talk to the powerful guys in politics and they will harm my project. And that's what I see. I see a lot of optimism at the other side of the Atlantic, because their experience with economic freedom is if you work hard, save, and invest, you reach your dreams. Here, it's very different. This is why so many young people in Europe are living to places where they can exercise their freedom. I can see this with my students all the time. More and more of our students, we have students all around the world, and more students start as Spanish residents and continue as residents of some different places in the world where they can exercise their freedom.
All right. I think if we ask in this room what impression of you all are about whether economic freedom is increasing or decreasing, I think we'll probably have very, very united response. So how is the development in the long term? Do we more, Matt, do we focus more on the bad news? Do we see things more bleakly and therefore we are maybe more skeptical of trying to innovate, less likely to try, or is that really the case?
It's a great question. So I do think, Brian Kaplan will, I think, back this up. He talks a lot about the pessimism bias that people have. Again, going back to the idea of our brains being sort of born in the Pleistocene era, and if you are walking through the woods and you see a rustle, you hear a rustle in the trees, you're more likely to pass on your genes if you presume that it's a saber-toothed tiger than if you presume that it's wind, right? And so we are all constantly attuned to threats. So I do think we are probably a little bit more aware of our threats. If you look at the long-term trend, both for a country like Spain as well as for the whole world, essentially what you see is a quite significant increase in economic freedom from, say, 1970 through 2000, and then a real leveling off. So, there's different stories that are happening in different parts of the world. Obviously, the fall of communism liberated a lot of people, and there's some extraordinary stories in Estonia and Lithuania and others. Obviously, there's major increases in economic freedom in Southeast Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, even China liberated quite a bit from 1978 onward. And then you also see some liberation even in the West, where top marginal tax rates went down, the brackets were indexed to inflation, you had essentially the abandonment of price controls. But after about 2000, things really, really level off. And some of this also gets to the idea, if you zoom in on specific types of, say, regulations, you can see, take Spain, for example, up through 2000, it was really extraordinary liberation in terms of economic freedom in Spain. Especially in credit markets, deregulation, monetary policy was stabilized, and you had with freedom to trade. But there were some dark spots, right? So size of government remains quite high in Spain, of course. And then among regulations, it's a little bit more mixed. So there's like quite a bit of freedom in terms of credit market regulation. There's no longer price controls on credit and things like that. Fewer government-owned enterprises in that area. However, a lot of the things that young people see firsthand, that's where some of the regulation remains extremely high. So labor regulation, for example, I understand there was, and Gabriel and others can speak to this probably with a lot more detail than I, but I understand there's significant reforms in 2012, for example, but a lot of backsliding since then, 2021 and later. And so it still remains quite high, quite difficult to hire and to fire, and that creates part of the extraordinarily high unemployment rate that you see in Spain. One of the things that happens is I think there is truth to the idea that people are attuned to the threats, but it also tends to be the case, in my view, that some of the brighter spots for freedom just happen to be kind of things that we don't notice as much. Where it really still catches you and where you notice it are labor laws, and people are just more attuned to that than they are. Not many people here are trying to start a credit card company, and so you don't see the easing in restrictions on that type of freedom.
So there is still hope. Speaking of hope, what is there to be optimistic right now? If I can ask all of you for a very brief final note on that, and then we open it up to the audience. So Ilya, do you want to start? Is there something to be optimistic about?
Behind me? Yeah, so at the very moment right now, I'm more pessimist than optimistic because I have seen this rise of these dangerous nationalistic movements. There has not been as much of a response to them as I think there needs to be. and also there are some problematic left-wing movements as well that in some countries are on the rise, not as much as the nationalistic ones, but they're there. Like think of Mélenchon in France, Bernie Sanders, and others like them in the United States, and there are other examples as well. But I think there is room for optimism. One, as I said before, the nationalistic enemy that we face now has a variety of weaknesses. They raise prices. Their level of intellectual sophistication tends to be low, and also they're inherently divisive. And the like, there tend to be a ceiling on how popular these types of leaders can be because they're so divisive, and also they're often corrupt, and that creates a constraint, and all of that can be exploited, and in fact has been exploited in the past to defeat similar movements. So I think there is room for hope and optimism, even though right now I think is a relatively bad moment, but it doesn't have to be that way forever. It doesn't even necessarily have to be that way for long. The opponents we face are not 10 feet tall. They have serious weaknesses, and we have to make use of them.
Gabriel, how optimistic are you?
Very optimistic, but let me start with some pessimism. No, Matt mentioned year 2000. I think it's really crucial to think back in year 2000. We were all optimistic in year 2000. Everyone was really optimistic. In Europe, basically everyone. And what happened? Politicians met in Lisbon in year 2000, and they made the Lisbon strategy. You know what it meant? And they say there is a goal for this strategy, and the goal is with those things in place, that all this regulation we are going to set. By 2010, Europe is going to be the most competitive, fast-growing, and knowledge-based economy in the world. What happened? None of them happened. And they set some measurements, and none of them happened. So in year 2010, they met again, and they realized nothing happened with the top-down approach, and they decided to do a new plan. At least the Soviets were a little bit humble. It was 5 years. These are 10-year plans. And in the new 10-year plans, it was for 2020, they wanted now to become the most competitive economy in the world. Nothing happened. I think by now, and this is why I'm optimist, by now, the whole of Europe population has realized that this doesn't work. This top-down approach doesn't work, and this is why you see more and more young people in Spain, for example, following classical liberal and libertarian authors, podcasts, YouTube channels, and I think it's a huge movement growing. And I'm also optimistic when I see that a speaker, someone who was a speaker at Students for Liberty conferences some years ago, is now the president of Argentina. So I can only be optimist when I see this trend now. But yeah, we have to continue fighting.
And Matt?
So kind of like the others, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. The pessimistic side, I think, is that you just have to be realistic that concentrated, organized interest groups have an extraordinary advantage, and they are not fans of freedom, right? Freedom may be optimal, but it is not necessarily the equilibrium, right? And that's because concentrated special interests benefit from barriers to entry. They benefit from subsidies. They benefit often from regulations that raise the costs of their rivals. They benefit, most importantly, from the status quo. And so they gum up the system, and they tend to oppose reforms. However, if you just look at that, we call that in economics, we call this, broadly, the public choice model is the model that turns economics, the lens of economics on public policy. How are votes supplied and demanded? How are regulations supplied and demanded? And the general lesson from public choice is quite pessimistic. But one of the things that attracted me to this research project and the idea of measuring economic freedom is that it is a nice antidote to some of that pessimism. Despite how gloomy some of those predictions are about special interests using the power of the state to enrich themselves at the expense of everybody else, you still find exceptions, right? You do find that some places in the world at some times manage to overcome their special interests, their public choice problems better than others, And it's a mix of good institutions, good constitutions, good culture, luck. But you do find that there is that, quite a bit of variation, and to me that is always a source of optimism, especially in a world where labor and capital are more competitive than ever. If you don't start a business in Europe, you can start it in Canada or the United States or Guatemala. And because states have to compete with one another for that increasingly mobile labor and capital, I do think that puts pressure on states to be better. And after about 20 years of sort of boring economic freedom reports, where we sort of saw this major increase in economic freedom through 2000 and then sort of stasis, you now are starting to see experiments as in Argentina and elsewhere, and I'm excited to see where that plays out. I'm also very worried about nationalism too. And also, just to kind of tie two observations, Gabriel, you talked about the optimism of Americans. I have to say, unfortunately, I see a little bit more of a zero-sum mindset in America than I used to. So I'm not sure that America will be leading things.
You mean the U.S., right?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. The little part of America that's the United States. Yeah.
We almost ended on a consciously optimistic note, but I think we have time for some questions from the audience. So can I ask for hands up if you are interested for a question, and we will get you mic.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the discussion. My question is about the Economic Freedom Index, or the calculations of it in general. So does it measure non-governmental yet inorganic interventions such as those by the cartels in Mexico, where they charge almost all small businesses unjustified fees, and other hidden economic interventions such as those by military-aligned enterprises in Egypt? And how can we reduce such non-governmental influence without expanding governmental institutions?
Oh, that's a great question. So yes, indirectly it measures that sort of thing through the Area 2, which is property rights and protection of persons and property and the legal system. So, this, you might sometimes view portions of the index as somewhat competing with one another to some degree, insofar as you have to raise taxes in order to fund a court system in order to protect persons and property, right? And so, and we measure all of that. So when they raise taxes, that limits your economic freedom. When they use those resources to protect your person and your property, that enhances your economic freedom, right? So it does get at the degree to which government's promise to protect persons and property is lived up to. It does get at that. As a general sort of summary of the empirical literature, it's actually it's exactly what you would expect. So at low levels of governance, where like Sudan, take Sudan as an example, where you have very low, you don't exactly have high marginal tax rates that are a problem, but extremely poor protection of persons and property. The government's not doing much. Then essentially what you really, really need is protection of persons and property, and you might need more government. But then when you look at more economically free places, the United States, Canada, a lot of Western Europe, those are places where protection of property rights is quite secure, and most of the damage that's being done there is inside the government components that are just high marginal tax rates that are undermining the incentives to work and save and produce.
Hi all, my name is Itamar Feldman. I work for the Ayn Rand Institute and the Center for Industrial Progress of Alex Epstein. Nice to meet you. I have two questions for you about things that were said in the panel, but I don't remember who said them. So someone said that studies found that Americans or people, countries that have more economic freedom tend to be less materialistic. What did you mean by that? Just can you expand on that?
Yeah, so there's social surveys on how people think about money and how worried they are about money and status. And there's studies that essentially find in those places where there's greater levels of economic freedom, people tend to be less concerned about money as a status symbol and are not as materialistic.
Okay, that's good to know. My second question is regarding a comment one of you, I think it was you, you said that there are more economic freedom than we think, but it's in places that are less visible to the public. And you said it as an optimistic note, but that sounded very pessimistic to me, because that means that where people actually see what happens, they want less freedom, and there is freedom only where people don't see what happens, and probably things, like I know, for example, the shale boom succeeded in the US because the Obama administration didn't know at the time how to stop it, they didn't know about it, but in Europe, they just banned fracking.
Correct. I mean, I think your analysis is right, is that the median voter does not necessarily favor more economic freedom. And so a lot of the ways in which we tend to get economic freedom is often by liberating in areas where there's not like a huge push for it. I've looked at two examples of, one of the best examples in the US of deregulation is airline and trucking deregulation in the 70s, and that was sort of a kind of a behind-the-scenes type effort. It wasn't necessarily front page of the newspapers or the public's necessarily clamoring for it.
I do think that's our time, unfortunately, but we are happy to continue the conversations afterwards when we finish today's sessions and we move on to the outdoor area. So I will now pass it on to Stefan, and thank you all for joining us for this panel.